Don't come home this year. Your sister doesn't want you there. My mother said it the way someone comments on the weather, flat and practical, as if she were reminding me to bring a coat, instead of telling me I was no longer welcome at my own family's Thanksgiving table. I remember the exact moment. I was standing in my kitchen in Chicago, phone pressed against my ear, the smell of pumpkin bread still lingering from the loaf I had just pulled out of the oven. I had flour on my sweater and a train ticket to Columbus tucked inside my purse. I had already packed my overnight bag. I had already planned what pie I would bring. There was no apology in her voice, no hesitation. Your sister's going through a lot right now, she added, softer but not kinder. She doesn't need stress. It's better if you stay where you are. 5 years later, she stood in the back row at my wedding and realized she had lost me for good. But that night, standing alone in my kitchen with flour on my hands and a cooling loaf of bread on the counter, I still thought this was just another holiday argument. I didn't know it was the beginning of the end. I swallowed hard and asked the only thing that came to mind. What did I do? You always make everything harder than it has to be, my mother said. Vanessa doesn't want drama this year. Drama. That word had followed me my whole life. It meant asking questions. It meant noticing when I was left out. It meant refusing to pretend I didn't see the pattern. I leaned against the counter and stared at the small paper turkey decoration taped to my fridge. I bought my ticket already, I said. It's non-refundable. Then don't use it. That was it. No negotiation. No pause to consider that I might be hurt. Just the click of the line going dead. I stood there listening to the silence on my phone long after she had hung up. Vanessa had finalized her divorce 2 months earlier. It had been messy, loud, expensive. According to my mother, she was fragile. According to my father, she needed stability. According to everyone, I needed to understand. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and called my dad. He answered on the fourth ring. Hey, kiddo. Did you know I asked? There was a pause long enough for me to picture him in his recliner television murmuring in the background, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when he wanted to disappear from a conversation. Your mom mentioned it, he said, and you're okay with it. It's just one holiday, Dulcie. Vanessa's been through a lot. I closed my eyes. I've been through things too. You know how she gets? He said almost under his breath. That was the truth right there. Not that I was dramatic, not that I caused tension. It was that Vanessa could not tolerate being uncomfortable, and my parents were afraid of her storms. Do you want me there? I asked. Silence. Dad, it's better if you listen to your mother this time. Something inside me went quiet, not shattered, not screaming, just quiet like a door closing gently in a room no one used anymore. Okay, I said. I understand. He started to say something else, but I ended the call first. I set my phone down and walked into my bedroom. My suitcase sat open on the bed, neatly packed with a sweater dress and the cranberry sauce recipe card I had copied from my grandmother years ago. I stood there looking at it and felt something strangely familiar. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. My 18th birthday came back to me in a flash. We had reservations at a steakhouse downtown. I had been so excited I curled my hair twice. Vanessa got into a fight with her boyfriend that afternoon and locked herself in her room. By dinner time, my mother said we couldn't possibly leave her alone in that state. We ordered pizza instead. The cake stayed in the fridge for 3 days. Then my graduate school ceremony. I had worked full-time and taken classes at night. When I walked across the stage, I scanned the auditorium for my parents. Their seats were empty. Vanessa had called crying because her husband hadn't shown up to a mediation meeting. My parents went to her house instead. We'll celebrate next weekend, my mother said afterward. We never did. Every memory carried the same lesson. Shrink yourself. Wait your turn. Don't make it harder. I picked up my phone and opened social media. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted proof I wasn't imagining things. Vanessa had already posted a picture. My parents' dining room table set with my grandmother's china candles, lit place cards neatly arranged. The caption read, "Grateful for the ones who show up." I counted the chairs. 4. There was no empty seat. I stared at that image until my eyes blurred. It wasn't just that I wasn't invited. It was that they had already rearranged the table to make my absence invisible. I clicked on our shared family album, access denied. I laughed, then a short sound that surprised even me. They hadn't just excluded me from dinner, they had erased me from the picture. For a moment, I considered calling back. I imagined myself pleading, explaining, offering to sit quietly, to promise not to bring anything up, to make myself as small as possible. I didn't. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen and turned off the oven light beneath the pumpkin bread. I wrapped it in foil and set it on the counter. I didn't throw it away. I didn't smash it in anger. I just let it sit there cooling in a house that felt too quiet. I took my train ticket out of my purse and held it between my fingers. It would have been easy to cancel it to get at least a partial credit. Instead, I opened the drawer beside the stove and slid it inside. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at a table that didn't want me. The house felt close around me like the walls were leaning in. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The November air hit my face sharp and clean. Chicago was already dressed for winter. The wind cut down the street between the buildings, carrying the distant sound of laughter from apartments where families were gathering. I started walking without a destination, past the corner diner where couples were lined up for pie, past the florist closing early, past a church with its doors propped open and music spilling onto the sidewalk. I kept my hands deep in my pockets and told myself I wasn't crying. The cold made my eyes water. That was all. For 30 years, I had tried to earn a place in that house in Columbus. I had edited myself down to manageable pieces. I had swallowed words. I had apologized for feelings. And still, when it came down to it, I was the easiest one to remove. The wind pushed harder against me as I crossed the next intersection. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't sit in my apartment staring at a table where I no longer existed. I thought I was just taking a walk to clear my head. I thought the night would pass quietly and I would go home and start over in the morning. I had no idea that the next few minutes would change everything. The wind coming off the lake cut straight through my coat and made my eyes sting as I turned the corner onto Michigan Avenue. Families were still pouring into restaurants, laughing too loudly, holding foil trays and wine bottles. Children bundled in puffy jackets that made them wobble when they walked. I kept my head down and let the current of people move around me like I was a rock in the middle of a river. No one bumped into me. No one noticed me. I passed a steakhouse with fogged windows and caught a glimpse through the glass of a long table near the front. An older man lifted a little girl into a high chair and pretended to drop her before settling her safely into place. She shrieked with laughter and reached for his face. The woman beside him swatted his arm, smiling like she had done it 1,000 times. Something tightened in my chest. Vanessa used to do that. Not the lifting children part, the commanding attention part. Every dinner, every holiday, every quiet evening that might have belonged to someone else, she found a way to tilt the spotlight toward herself. If she was happy, we celebrated her joy. If she was upset, we reorganized the evening around her pain. Be the mature one, my mother would whisper to me when we were younger. You're stronger. Stronger meant quieter. The memory faded as a gust of wind pushed me forward. I wrapped my scarf tighter and crossed at the light. Halfway across, I noticed a man on the opposite sidewalk. He looked to be in his mid-60s, tall, broad shoulders beneath a heavy wool coat. He was walking alone, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed against the cold. He slowed. It wasn't dramatic. He just stopped as if he had forgotten something. Then his hand moved to his chest. The traffic noise seemed to dim in my ears. I watched him bend slightly at the waist. A few people walked around him without stopping. He took one step backward, unsteady, and then his knees buckled. He went down hard on the sidewalk. I didn't think. My body moved before my brain caught up. I ran across the street horns blaring somewhere behind me, boots slipping against the damp pavement. "Sir, can you hear me?" I said as I dropped beside him. His eyes were open but unfocused. His mouth worked like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. One hand clutched at his coat. I fumbled for my phone with shaking fingers and dialed 911. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm. I gave the operator the location, told her he had collapsed, possible heart attack. The operator asked if he was breathing. I leaned closer. His breaths were shallow, uneven. I couldn't feel a steady pulse. "I need you to start chest compressions," she said. I had taken a CPR course years ago at the community center, where I volunteered on weekends. I remembered the plastic dummy, the instructor, correcting the placement of my hands. Push hard, push fast. I laced my fingers together and placed the heel of my hand in the center of his chest. I began to press. 1, 2, 3, 4. His body felt heavier than the mannequin ever had. My arms trembled almost immediately, but I kept going. "You're going to be okay," I said, not sure if he could hear me. "Stay with me." A small crowd gathered. Someone asked if help was coming. I nodded without looking up. I counted out loud to keep rhythm. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. My mouth hovered over his, but I hesitated for half a second before sealing it over his and breathing. "Come on," I whispered. The sirens cut through the air a minute later, though it felt much longer. My knees ached from the concrete. I kept pressing until hands replaced mine, firm and practiced. Paramedics knelt beside him, moving efficiently, attaching pads, giving instructions I barely registered. One of them glanced at me. "How long were you doing compressions?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "since he went down." "You probably bought him time," the paramedic said. They lifted him onto a stretcher. As they worked, his coat shifted, and a leather wallet slid out onto the sidewalk. I grabbed it and handed it to one of the EMTs. A photograph slipped halfway from the clear sleeve. A large group stood in front of what looked like a suburban house. 3 generations, maybe more. The man lying on the stretcher stood in the center, arm around a woman with silver hair and kind eyes. The caption, written in neat handwriting beneath the photo, read, "Callahan Family Reunion." I don't know why that detail hit me so hard. Maybe because there were so many of them. So many faces turned toward the camera like they belonged to something solid. "We're taking him to Northwestern Memorial," the paramedic said. I nodded. They loaded him into the ambulance and the doors slammed shut. The siren started again, louder, now urgent. For a second, I stood frozen on the sidewalk. The crowd began to disperse, already returning to their evening. A couple stepped around me, complaining about the cold. The world continued like nothing extraordinary had happened. I could have walked away then. I had done my part. I was no one to him. But I found myself raising my arm to hail a cab instead. The hospital lights were too bright after the darkness outside. The smell of antiseptic and overheated air wrapped around me as I approached the emergency desk. "I was with the man who just came in," I said. "He collapsed downtown." "Are you family?" the nurse asked. "No." She gave me a look that wasn't unkind but was careful. "You can wait over there." I sat in a row of plastic chairs under a television that played muted holiday commercials. People in festive sweaters laughed across the screen. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the floor tiles. My phone buzzed once, a notification from social media. I didn't open it. After a while, a doctor walked through the double doors and spoke quietly to the nurse. I caught the words "massive cardiac event," "stabilized for now," "critical." I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until I let it out slowly. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. I looked up to see a woman in her mid-60s rushing toward the desk, her coat half-buttoned, her face pale with fear. 2 younger adults followed close behind a man and a woman, both tense, both scanning the room like they were searching for something they couldn't afford to lose. "Arthur Callahan," the woman said, her voice shaking. "My husband was brought in?" The nurse nodded and gestured for them to wait. The woman turned then, and her eyes landed on me. I don't know what gave me away. Maybe it was the fact that I was the only person sitting alone with a coat still on, hands clenched too tightly in my lap. She walked straight toward me. "Are you the one who saved my husband?" she asked. Her voice was trembling, but there was steel beneath it, like she needed the answer to stay upright. I stood up too quickly. I tried to explain what had happened, that I had just been there, that anyone would have done the same. The words sounded small even to me. She reached for my hands and held them tightly between hers. "Thank you," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you for not walking past him." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, unexpected and sharp. The younger man stepped forward. "I'm Daniel," he said. "That's my father." The younger woman nodded, her arms wrapped around herself. "Claire." They looked at me like I was something fragile and important at the same time. The doctor returned a few minutes later and explained that Arthur was in surgery. It would take time. Margaret, the silver-haired woman, squeezed my hands again. "Please stay," she said. I hesitated. I didn't belong here. I wasn't part of their story. But I stayed. We sat together in that bright waiting room, 3 strangers and a woman who refused to let go of my hand. Daniel paced. Claire made phone calls in a low voice. I listened without meaning to. Words drifted toward me. Board vote, emergency meeting. This couldn't have happened tonight. I glanced at Margaret. She noticed and gave a small, tired smile. "It's been a difficult week," she said. Arthur refuses to slow down. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Hours passed. Coffee went cold in paper cups. My phone stayed silent. No missed calls from my parents. No messages asking if I had made it home safely. When the surgeon finally came out and said Arthur had made it through the procedure, Margaret broke down completely. She pressed her forehead to my shoulder and sobbed in a way that felt both devastating and sacred. "He's going to need rest," the doctor said. "But you got him here in time." Margaret looked at me again like she was memorizing my face. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Dulcie," I said. She nodded slowly. "Dulcie." Daniel stepped closer. "We won't forget what you did tonight." I shook my head. "I didn't do it for recognition." "I know," Margaret said. "That's why it matters." A nurse approached and asked if they were ready to see him. They stood together instinctively, a unit moving as one. Margaret turned back to me before following the nurse. "Are you coming?" she asked. I froze for half a second. I wasn't family. I had no claim to that room, but she was still holding my hand. And for the first time all night, I didn't feel invisible. I nodded. We walked toward the double doors together. The ICU doors swung closed behind us with a soft hiss, sealing us into a world that smelled of antiseptic and humming machines. Arthur lay in the bed, surrounded by wires and monitors, his broad frame suddenly diminished by the hospital gown and the steady rise and fall of the ventilator. The man I had seen collapse on the sidewalk looked different here, stripped of his coat and his dignity vulnerable, in a way that made my throat tighten. Margaret stepped to his side immediately. She took his hand and bent close, whispering something I couldn't hear. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed, jaw clenched, while Claire wiped her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. I hovered near the doorway, unsure where to put my hands. I had seen him at his most fragile on the pavement, but this felt more intimate, more permanent. "He fought them today," Margaret said quietly without turning around. "Fought who I asked before I could stop myself." Daniel glanced at me, then at his mother. "The board," he said. Arthur's eyelids fluttered slightly, though he did not wake. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a fragile reassurance. "He never misses a meeting," Claire added. "Not in 40 years. Even tonight." Margaret finally looked back at me. "He should have come home. But he said there are moments when you either stand up or you lose everything you built." The words landed somewhere deep inside me. I had spent years standing down to keep the peace. Arthur had apparently done the opposite. A nurse stepped in to check his vitals and gently suggested we keep the visit brief. Margaret leaned down and kissed her husband's forehead. "We're here," she whispered. As we stepped back into the corridor, the weight of the night settled over us again. It was close to 2 in the morning. "You should go home," Claire said to me. "You've done enough." "I don't mind staying a little longer," I replied. Margaret studied me carefully. "You came with him," she said. "You didn't just disappear." I shrugged. I didn't want him to be alone. Something in her expression shifted. Most people would have waited for someone else to handle it. I almost said I'm used to being the someone else, but I swallowed it. We moved back into the waiting room. Daniel paced near the vending machine, scrolling through his phone. Claire spoke in hushed tones to someone about postponing a morning call. I sat beside Margaret again. After a few minutes, she said Arthur founded Callahan Construction in 1982, started with 2 trucks and a borrowed office, built everything from scratch. I nodded. That must have taken a lot of work. It took everything she said. Every holiday, every birthday, he showed up too late. I thought about my own holidays, how showing up late had never been the issue. Daniel returned and lowered himself into the chair across from us. "The vote was supposed to happen next week," he said. Claire stiffened. "We can postpone it, not without consequences. The investors are already circling." Margaret sighed. "Arthur believes someone inside the company has been feeding them numbers, pushing for him to step down." I didn't mean to lean forward, but I did. "Feeding them numbers, how?" Daniel looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Inflated liabilities. Forecasted losses that don't line up with actual contracts. Manipulated projections," I said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "You understand that." "I work in compliance and risk assessment," I said. "Mostly corporate reporting and internal controls." Claire let out a short breath. "That explains the CPR confidence. It was a required certification," I said. Daniel studied me more carefully now. Tonight was the worst possible timing. I almost smiled at that. "There's never a good night for a heart attack." He gave a reluctant nod. Margaret placed her hand over mine again. "What were you doing downtown tonight?" I hesitated. I could have lied. Said I was meeting friends. Said I was heading home from dinner. "I was walking," I admitted. "I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving this year." Silence settled over us, heavy but not uncomfortable. "By your family?" Margaret asked gently. I nodded. "My sister didn't want stress." Daniel muttered something under his breath that sounded like "that's ridiculous." Claire's expression softened. Margaret squeezed my hand. "I've spent 30 years watching families in hospital corridors," she said quietly. "The ones who show up when it's inconvenient, those are the ones that matter." The words felt like they had been placed directly into the hollow space in my chest. A doctor returned briefly to say Arthur was stable for the night. He would remain in ICU under close observation. Margaret visibly relaxed for the first time since arriving. "You can see him again in the morning," the doctor said. Daniel glanced at me. We should probably head home for a few hours. Mom needs rest. Margaret shook her head immediately. I'm not leaving. Claire sighed. Then we're staying too. They all turned to look at me at once. You don't have to sit here all night, Daniel said. I realized then that I wanted to. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt. I simply didn't want to walk back into my empty apartment and stare at walls that had already echoed too loudly that evening. I can stay a little while longer, I said. Margaret's eyes filled again, but this time there was steadiness in them. Dulcie, she said, we don't forget people who show up. Daniel's phone buzzed. He stepped aside to answer. His voice dropped tense and controlled. Yes, we'll delay it. No, he's alive. Claire folded her arms. It's Thomas, she whispered to me. Thomas, our chief financial officer, she added. He's been pushing hard for restructuring. Restructuring how I asked. Selling off divisions, forcing Dad into early retirement. He says the company is over-leveraged. And your father disagrees. Claire gave a humorless laugh. That's an understatement. Daniel ended the call and walked back toward us, jaw tight. He wants to proceed with the vote anyway. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. Not without Arthur there. Daniel exhaled sharply. That's what he's counting on. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not just fear for Arthur's health, but the quiet realization that this family's crisis went beyond a medical emergency. There were people waiting for him to fall. Daniel glanced at me again. I don't mean to drag you into this. You've done more than enough. I shook my head slowly. You're not dragging me. Margaret tilted her head slightly. What would you do, Dulcie? The question startled me. No one had asked me that in a long time. I'd review the numbers independently, I said. Make sure projections match actual contract performance. If someone is manipulating data, it leaves fingerprints. It always does. Daniel's expression shifted from polite gratitude to something sharper. You'd know how to look for that. I nodded. Claire leaned back in her chair. Mom, this might actually help. Margaret didn't take her eyes off me. You don't even know us, she said. I surprised myself with the answer. I know enough. The waiting room clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. If there's something wrong, we need to find it fast. Margaret's gaze softened again. Let's focus on Arthur tonight, she said. The rest can wait until morning. But it couldn't not really. The tension sat there between us like an unspoken agreement. Around 3:30, Claire finally convinced her mother to go home for a few hours. Daniel insisted on driving her. They turned to me again as they gathered their coats. Margaret pressed a small card into my hand. My number, she said. Please answer if I call. I will, I promised. Daniel hesitated. Would you consider looking at some documents tomorrow? I looked down at the card in my hand. Callahan Construction was printed neatly beneath Margaret's name. Yes, I said. I would. Claire gave me a tired smile. Then we'll see you in the morning. They walked down the corridor together, three figures bound by shared history and fear. I remained seated under the fluorescent lights alone again, but not in the same way as earlier that night. For years, I had been the extra chair no one noticed when it disappeared. Tonight, someone had noticed when I stayed. I leaned back in the plastic seat and closed my eyes briefly. I had stepped out into the cold because I didn't belong anywhere. Now I was sitting in a hospital at 3 a.m, holding a business card from a woman who had looked at me like I mattered. I didn't know yet how deep the trouble at Callahan Construction went. I didn't know how much of myself I was about to invest in people who had only just learned my name. All I knew was that when morning came, I wasn't walking away. Margaret called me 2 days later while I was standing in line at the grocery store staring at a display of canned cranberry sauce I did not need. Arthur is stable, she said, her voice steadier now, but still carrying the strain of sleepless nights. They moved him out of ICU this morning. Relief washed through me in a way that felt too personal for someone I had only met 48 hours earlier. That's good news. We're having dinner Sunday, she continued. Just immediate family. Nothing fancy. I would like you to come. I glanced around at the fluorescent lights and the strangers pushing carts past me. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. There was no pressure in her tone, no obligation, just an invitation. I'll come, I heard myself say. Evanston was quieter than downtown Chicago, tree-lined streets and older brick homes that felt established, settled. The Callahan house sat on a corner lot with wide windows and a wraparound porch that looked like it had held decades of summer evenings and arguments and reconciliations. When I rang the doorbell, my stomach tightened the way it used to before family gatherings back in Columbus. But this felt different. There was no script I had to follow, no version of myself I needed to present. Margaret opened the door before the second chime. Dulcie, she said warmly, stepping forward and pulling me into a hug that was firm and unhesitating. I'm so glad you're here. The scent of roasted chicken and herbs drifted through the house. Inside frame photographs covered the hallway walls. Arthur in a hard hat standing beside half-finished buildings. Daniel and Claire as children with missing teeth. A family reunion photo I recognized from the wallet. You found your way all right? Daniel asked from the living room. Yes, I said. It's a beautiful neighborhood. Arthur was sitting in a recliner near the fireplace, a blanket draped over his legs. He looked thinner than he had on the sidewalk, but his eyes were sharp. There she is, he said. The woman who tackled me on Michigan Avenue. I smiled despite myself. I didn't tackle you. Felt like it, he replied. You broke my fall. We both knew that wasn't exactly how it happened, but the joke eased the tension. Claire handed me a glass of water and gestured toward the dining room. We're keeping it simple tonight, she said. Mom refused to cancel entirely. Margaret called from the kitchen, because life doesn't pause every time it gets scared. Dinner was set around a solid oak table that looked like it had seen decades of meals. 4 place settings were already arranged. Margaret reached into a drawer and pulled out a 5th card. She wrote my name on it in careful script and placed it beside the others. You didn't have to do that, I said softly. She looked at me as if the idea were absurd. Of course I did. Arthur insisted on sitting at the head of the table despite Margaret's protest. I am not an invalid, he grumbled. Just temporarily inconvenienced. Daniel rolled his eyes. You collapsed on a sidewalk 2 nights ago, and I got back up. Arthur shot back, though his smile softened the edge. As we passed dishes around, conversation drifted naturally. For the first time that week, I wasn't thinking about Thanksgiving in Columbus or the empty chair in my parents' dining room. I was listening to Claire tease Daniel about overcooking the stuffing and watching Margaret scold Arthur for reaching for a second glass of wine. Midway through the meal, Daniel set down his fork. We need to talk about the board meeting, he said quietly. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. Not tonight. It has to be tonight, he replied. Thomas is pushing for a vote on Monday. Arthur leaned back in his chair. Let him push. You know he's not bluffing, Claire said. The investors want numbers that justify restructuring. He says we're over-leveraged. Arthur's jaw set. We are not over-leveraged. We have 3 municipal contracts breaking ground next quarter. Then why do his projections show losses? Daniel asked. The air in the room shifted. I kept my eyes on my plate for a moment, not wanting to intrude. Margaret glanced at me. Dulcie works in compliance, she said gently. Arthur's gaze turned toward me. Is that right? Mostly internal reporting and risk assessment, I answered, making sure what's being presented matches what's actually happening. Arthur gave a slow nod. That's a rare skill. Daniel leaned forward. Thomas presented a forecast showing a 30% drop in revenue over the next fiscal year. It doesn't align with what we're seeing on the ground. Have you reviewed the raw data behind it? I asked. Daniel shook his head. We've seen summaries. He controls the reporting pipeline. Claire added, he claims external auditors flagged concerns, but we haven't seen the full documentation. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not anxiety this time, but focus. If someone is manipulating projections, it usually shows up in timing differences or inflated liabilities. Deferred revenue can be recategorized to create artificial gaps. Arthur studied me closely. You're saying someone could make the company look weaker than it is? Yes, I said. If they wanted to justify leadership change or attract a buyout at a lower valuation. Margaret's fingers stilled against her napkin. You think someone inside is doing that? I didn't answer immediately. I don't know yet, but numbers don't move without leaving footprints. Daniel sat back slowly. We should have asked for help sooner. Arthur's expression darkened. I trusted Thomas. He's been with us 12 years. I treated him like family. The word family hung in the air heavier than any business term. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Arthur's. Trust is not a flaw, she said quietly. Claire looked at me. Would you be willing to review the reports with us? I hesitated. This wasn't my company. It wasn't my battle. Arthur broke the silence. Dulce, I don't ask favors lightly, but I won't let this company be dismantled because I had the misfortune of collapsing at the wrong time. I thought about the way he had fallen alone on a cold sidewalk. I thought about how quickly the crowd had begun to move around him, as if he were already gone. I can look at the reports, I said, but if I find something, you'll need to be prepared to act. Daniel nodded without hesitation. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table. Thank you. Later, while Arthur rested in the living room and Daniel pulled up files on his laptop, I stepped into the kitchen to help Margaret clear plates. You didn't have to say yes, she murmured as she rinsed dishes. I know. She studied me in that quiet, assessing way she had at the hospital. You're not someone who shrinks in a crisis. The comment caught me off guard. I've spent most of my life shrinking, I admitted. She turned off the faucet and faced me fully. Not here, you haven't. The warmth in her voice felt unfamiliar, like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I stepped aside to check it. A message from Vanessa. Mom said you embarrassed her by not coming. You always have to make everything about you. I stared at the words, then slipped the phone back into my pocket without responding. Margaret watched my face. Everything all right? Yes, I said after a moment. Just noise. She nodded, not pressing further. There's too much noise in this world already. When I returned to the dining room, Daniel had spreadsheets open across the table. Rows of figures blurred together at first glance, but patterns began to emerge the longer I studied them. Here, I said, pointing to a column, these liabilities are categorized as short-term, but the contracts tied to them extend into next year. Why aren't they being offset? Daniel frowned. They should be. Arthur leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Thomas presented those as immediate risks. They're not immediate, I said. Not if the revenue schedule is intact. Claire let out a slow breath. So he's overstating exposure? It appears that way, I answered carefully. I'd need access to the underlying contracts to confirm. Arthur's voice hardened. You'll have it. A quiet resolve settled around the table. This wasn't panic. It was clarity. Daniel closed the laptop. If someone is trying to force a sale, we need to move quickly. Arthur looked at me again. You stepped in when I fell, he said. I won't forget that. The weight of his words pressed against my ribs. I didn't step in to earn anything. Margaret smiled faintly. That's exactly why it matters. As the evening wound down, Claire packed leftovers into containers and Daniel made plans to meet me at the office Monday morning. Arthur insisted on walking me to the door despite Margaret's protests. The night air felt softer than it had on Thanksgiving. Thank you, he said quietly once we were alone on the porch. Not just for that night. For tonight. You're welcome. He studied me for a moment. Whatever's happening inside that company, I intend to face it head on. I believe you, I said. Driving back to Chicago, I realized something I hadn't expected. I hadn't felt invisible once that entire evening. Not at the table, not in conversation, not even when I challenged their numbers. My phone buzzed again at a red light. Another message from Vanessa. Dad says you're being dramatic. It was one holiday. I didn't reply. For the first time, I wasn't trying to argue my way back into a place that didn't want me. I was stepping into a room where I had been asked to help protect something that mattered. And on Monday morning, I was going to find out just how deep that protection would have to go. By the time Monday arrived, I had barely slept. The spreadsheets Daniel emailed me late Sunday night glowed against the darkness of my apartment as I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight. Rows of projected losses, flagged liabilities, consulting expenses categorized as strategic adjustments. The language was careful, polished, almost reassuring. But numbers have a rhythm. When you stare at them long enough, you start to hear it. And this rhythm was off. I traced a recurring line item labeled Advisory Restructuring Fee. It appeared small at first glance, buried inside quarterly summaries. But when I filtered the data and isolated it over 12 months, the total grew large enough to raise a question. I cross-referenced the vendor identification number. It belonged to an entity I did not recognize. I searched public records. The registered address led to a modest office suite in Schaumburg. The registered agent name matched a holding company incorporated just 18 months earlier. The timing aligned perfectly with Thomas Klein's increased authority within Callahan Construction. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. It could be coincidence. It could be legitimate. But when I traced one more layer, the name attached to the holding company board stopped me cold. A last name that matched Thomas's wife. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. A notification from social media. Vanessa had posted again. I didn't mean to open it, but I did. A photo of my parents at their dining table smiling too brightly. The caption read, "Grateful for the people who show up without causing chaos." My name was tagged beneath it. Comments scrolled quickly, some supportive, some questioning. One aunt had written, "Families fall apart when people forget loyalty." I closed the app. The old version of me would have responded, explained, defended. Instead, I reopened the spreadsheet and saved a copy of the flagged entries. At 9:30, I walked into Callahan Construction Headquarters. The building was modern but understated glass and steel without unnecessary flair. The lobby receptionist glanced up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "You're here to see Mr. Callahan," she asked. "Daniel," I said. She nodded and handed me a visitor badge. The hallway beyond buzzed with muted tension. Conversations lowered as I passed. I wasn't imagining it. News traveled fast in companies this size. Daniel met me in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He looked tired but focused. "Did you find anything?" he asked before I had even set down my bag. I opened my laptop and turned it toward him. "These advisory fees," I said. "They route through a shell company incorporated last year. The board listing ties back to Thomas's family." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without full forensic access," I replied. "But it's enough to question motive." He ran a hand through his hair. He told the board those fees were necessary to prepare for potential acquisition. An acquisition he positioned as inevitable because of projected losses, I said. Losses inflated by recategorizing revenue and accelerating liabilities. Daniel swore under his breath. "There's more," I added. "Some of the projected downturn relies on delayed recognition of municipal contracts that are already signed." Meaning, he said slowly, if those contracts were acknowledged properly, the narrative shifts. Yes, from instability to expansion. Daniel looked out the window for a long moment. "My father built this company from nothing." Thomas sat at our dinner table. He knew every holiday, every story. "Trust makes good camouflage," I said quietly. A knock interrupted us. Claire stepped inside, her expression tight. "The investors sent formal notice. They want an emergency vote moved up to Thursday." Daniel exhaled sharply. "He's accelerating." Claire's gaze flicked toward me. "Can we prove this before then?" I hesitated. "We can present discrepancies. But to withstand scrutiny, we need independent confirmation." Daniel nodded once. "Then we move now." Before we could say anything further, my phone buzzed again. A number I didn't recognize. I stepped into the hallway to answer. "This is Dulce," I said. A man's voice responded, smooth and controlled. "You're involving yourself in matters that don't concern you." My stomach dropped. "Who is this?" "You know who this is." "Thomas." I kept my voice steady. "If you have something to say it directly." "You're not an employee here," he said. "You have no authority to review internal documents." "I have permission from the family," I replied. A pause. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Families can be unpredictable when under stress. It would be unfortunate if you were caught in the fallout." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice." The call ended before I could respond. I stood in the hallway staring at my reflection in the glass wall. For years, I had been told I was too sensitive, too dramatic. Now a man I barely knew was attempting to intimidate me into silence. I walked back into the conference room. "That was Thomas," I said. "He knows we're looking." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Good." Claire crossed her arms. This just became open conflict. Later that afternoon, Arthur insisted on coming into the office despite Margaret's protests. He walked slowly but upright, refusing assistance. When Daniel summarized what I had found, Arthur listened without interruption. "He siphoned money through his own connections," Arthur said finally, "and tried to position me as the liability." "It appears that way," I answered carefully. Arthur leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I brought him in after his previous firm collapsed, gave him a second chance." Claire's voice was tight. "Some people see kindness as opportunity." Before we could move forward, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. I stepped into Arthur's office to take it. "Dulcie," he said without greeting. "We need to talk." "I'm at work," I replied. "This won't take long. Your sister is struggling. Her legal bills are overwhelming." I closed my eyes briefly. "What does that have to do with me?" "You've always been the stable one," he said. "Maybe you could loan her something. Help her get back on her feet." The irony nearly made me laugh. I was standing in the middle of uncovering corporate fraud, and he was asking me to subsidize the sister who had erased me from Thanksgiving. "Dad," I said quietly when I needed help, "where were you?" Silence crackled through the line. "That's not fair," he murmured. "It is," I replied. "I'm not sending money." He sighed heavily. "Family helps family. Family shows up," I said before ending the call. When I returned to the conference room, Daniel looked up. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I answered. And for the first time in my life, I meant it in a different way. We spent the rest of the afternoon outlining a strategy. Daniel contacted an independent forensic accounting firm. Claire drafted communication to the board, requesting a temporary delay pending review. By early evening, word had reached Thomas that an audit was being initiated. He stormed into the hallway outside the conference room, his voice sharp but controlled. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can resolve concerns internally." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "Transparency benefits everyone." Thomas's eyes shifted to me. "You're out of your depth." I held his stare. "If the numbers are clean, the audit will confirm it." He said nothing more, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. When I left the building, the sky was already dark. My phone buzzed again. A message from Vanessa. "You always ruin things. Mom's crying." I stared at the screen and felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't anger. It was distance. For years, I had absorbed the blame to keep the peace. Now I was watching the pattern from outside of it. As I drove home, I realized something had shifted permanently. I was no longer fighting to be included. I was fighting to protect something that mattered. And if Thomas believed intimidation would push me back into silence, he had underestimated how little I had left to lose. Tuesday morning, I walked into Callahan Construction with a visitor badge that felt less temporary than it had the day before. Daniel had arranged for me to sign a short-term consulting agreement, simple language, but legally binding. Confidentiality clauses, access authorization. I read every line before signing. Not because I didn't trust them, but because trust without clarity had already cost too much in my life. The receptionist handed me a new badge, this one, with my name printed instead of handwritten. Employees watched quietly as I clipped it to my blazer. Whispers traveled faster than any official memo. Daniel met me in the executive suite. The independent forensic firm would arrive within the hour. "Thomas has been unusually calm," he said. "That worries me more than if he were angry." "Calm usually means contingency," I replied. The auditors arrived with briefcases and polite professionalism. Their lead partner, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a measured tone, introduced herself as Karen Mills. "We're here to review reporting structure, vendor payments, and liability categorization," she said. "We'll need full access." Daniel nodded. "You have it." Thomas appeared in the doorway just as Karen finished speaking. His expression was composed, almost bored. "This seems excessive," he said lightly. Karen did not look at him. Transparency is never excessive. Thomas's gaze shifted to me. "Still here, I see." "For now," I answered. He smiled thinly and walked away. By midday, the auditors had already flagged anomalies in deferred revenue recognition. Karen called Daniel and me into a smaller conference room. "The consulting entity receiving recurring payments has no deliverables attached," she said plainly. "There are no documented services rendered." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Can you trace ownership?" Karen nodded. "We're in the process, but preliminary results suggest familial ties to the CFO." "Familial ties," I repeated quietly. Karen's expression did not change. "Yes." A heavy silence settled between us. My phone vibrated against the table. I glanced down at the screen. "Vanessa," I ignored it. "Mom says you're trying to embarrass the family," the message read seconds later. "What are you even doing in Evanston?" I locked the screen without replying. Daniel noticed. "Everything all right?" "Just noise," I said. He gave a short nod. "We have enough of that here." By late afternoon, the tension in the office felt electric. Conversations stopped abruptly when Thomas entered rooms. Employees avoided eye contact. Loyalty was shifting quietly, though no one would admit it yet. Around 3, Thomas sent a message requesting a private meeting. I considered declining. Then I accepted. His office overlooked the river floor to ceiling glass, framing a skyline that spoke of stability and power. He gestured for me to sit. "You're intelligent," he began smoothly. "I can see why Arthur likes you." "This isn't about liking me," I replied. He folded his hands. "You've stepped into a complicated situation. Corporate transitions are rarely clean. Manipulation rarely is," I said. A flicker crossed his face, gone almost immediately. "Be careful with that word. Be careful with your projections," I answered. He leaned back in his chair. "You think you understand what's happening here? You don't. This company needs restructuring. Arthur is emotionally attached to a model that no longer works. And siphoning funds through shell companies helps that transition," how I asked evenly. For the first time, his composure cracked. "That's an accusation. It's a question backed by data." His gaze hardened. "You're not an employee. You have no standing." I held his stare. I have documentation. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. Without turning around, he said, I know about your family situation. The words landed like a slap. He continued, your sister's divorce was public. Financial strain, public conflict. You don't want your personal life scrutinized the way you're scrutinizing mine. I felt heat rise in my chest, but my voice remained steady. If you believe threatening me will make me step aside, you don't understand me at all. He turned, then eyes cold. Everyone has pressure points? Not anymore, I said. I left his office without waiting for dismissal. Back in the hallway, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from recognition. I had spent my entire life navigating people who used leverage to maintain control. Vanessa used emotion. My mother used guilt. Thomas used authority. The pattern was the same. Silence benefits the aggressor. Near 5:00, Daniel called an impromptu executive meeting. Arthur insisted on attending despite Margaret's objections. He walked into the boardroom slower than usual, but with unmistakable presence. Karen presented preliminary findings calmly and without drama. The advisory fees lack substantiation. The revenue projections appear artificially depressed. There is sufficient cause for deeper investigation. Thomas interjected sharply. Preliminary does not mean conclusive. Arthur raised his hand slightly. Let her finish. Karen did. As the room absorbed her words, Arthur's breathing grew heavier. I watched his hand drift toward his chest. Are you all right? I asked quietly. I'm fine, he replied, but his color had paled. The argument escalated quickly. Thomas insisted the projections reflected prudent conservatism. Daniel countered with contract schedules. Claire demanded transparency. Arthur suddenly gripped the edge of the table. For a brief second, the room froze. We're done for today, I said firmly, standing before anyone else could respond. This meeting is adjourned. Daniel immediately moved to Arthur's side. I'm not fragile, Arthur muttered, but he allowed Daniel to help him sit back. Thomas watched silently, calculating. Once Arthur was settled, I turned toward Thomas. If your data withstands scrutiny, you have nothing to fear from a full audit. He said nothing. After the meeting dispersed, I found Margaret waiting in Arthur's office. She had come as soon as Daniel called. You cannot let him push you like this, she said softly, brushing a hand through Arthur's hair. Arthur looked at me instead. I trusted the wrong man. That doesn't make you weak, I replied. It makes him opportunistic. Margaret met my eyes. You stepped in before. You're stepping in again. I felt the weight of that. I'm not doing this for control. I know, she said. That's why we trust you. Trust. The word felt heavier than any contract. That night back in my apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my phone. Vanessa had left 2 voicemails, one accusing, one dramatic. You're tearing everything apart, she said in the second message. Why do you always have to make things bigger than they are? I didn't call her back. Instead, I opened my laptop and drafted a formal memo outlining recommended next steps for the audit. Independent review of all vendor contracts, temporary suspension of discretionary payments, direct reporting to the board rather than through Thomas. For years, I had been told I was too much, too questioning, too unwilling to let things slide. Now those exact traits were the reason someone's life work might survive. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. You're playing a dangerous game. I stared at the words. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand. Dangerous or not, I wasn't stepping back. Because this time, silence would not protect anyone worth protecting. The forensic team returned Wednesday morning with thicker folders and quieter expressions. Karen did not waste time with pleasantries. We traced the advisory payments through 3-layered entities, she said, placing documents on the conference table. All roads lead back to a holding company controlled by Mr. Klein's brother-in-law. Daniel's knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. That's direct conflict of interest. Arthur sat straighter than he had all week. His face had regained some color, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Show me everything, he said. Karen slid copies toward him. The restructuring narrative is built on manipulated forecasts. If those projections are corrected, the company's valuation shifts significantly upward. In plain terms, Claire said he was creating panic to justify a takeover. Yes, Karen answered calmly. I felt something cold and steady settle in my chest. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was proof. Daniel turned to me. You saw this before any of us did. I shook my head. I just asked questions. Arthur looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. I should have asked them sooner. Trust is not a weakness, I repeated gently. Before we could say more, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. The board wants an emergency session this afternoon. Thomas requested it himself. Claire let out a slow breath. He's going to try to control the narrative before this circulates further. Arthur pushed himself up from his chair. Then we'll meet him there. By 2 in the afternoon, the executive boardroom felt smaller than usual. 6 board members sat along the polished table, some loyal to Arthur for decades, others newer faces representing investor interests. Thomas stood at the far end with a stack of printed slides. He began confidently. Recent instability has underscored the urgent need for transition. Mr. Callahan's health event only reinforces my recommendation for immediate restructuring. Arthur remained silent, hands folded in front of him. Thomas clicked to the next slide. Revenue decline projections displayed in bold red numbers. Concerned murmurs rippled across the room. Daniel leaned forward. Those projections are based on reclassified liabilities and deferred contract recognition. Thomas smiled thinly. Conservative forecasting protects shareholders. I stood before I had time to reconsider. May I speak? Several heads turned toward me. One board member frowned. And you are? Dulce Whitford, I said evenly. Independent compliance consultant engaged at the request of the Callahan family. Thomas interjected. She has no formal standing here. Karen rose from her seat near the back of the room. Our firm was retained to conduct an independent review. Miss Whitford's initial findings prompted that engagement. Silence fell. I opened the folder in front of me. The advisory restructuring fees routed through Schaumburg Holdings lack documented services. Ownership traces to Mr. Klein's extended family. A sharp intake of breath came from one of the investors. Thomas's composure cracked visibly. Those are legitimate consulting arrangements. Then provide deliverables, I replied calmly. Arthur finally spoke. Thomas, have you personally benefited from these payments? Thomas hesitated just long enough for the room to notice. That is an offensive implication. It's a direct question, Arthur said. Karen placed a summary on the table. The payments coincide with artificially depressed revenue reporting. When corrected, the company's financial position improves substantially. A board member who had remained quiet until now cleared his throat. If this is accurate, then the urgency for restructuring disappears. Another member leaned back, studying Thomas carefully. Why were these relationships not disclosed? Thomas's voice sharpened. Because they were immaterial. They were material enough to influence projections, Daniel said. The air in the room shifted. Authority began to change direction. Thomas attempted one last maneuver. Mr. Callahan's recent health scare demonstrates leadership risk. Investors require stability. Arthur stood slowly, deliberately. Stability does not come from deception. The room fell silent. For the first time since I met him, Thomas looked uncertain. A motion was raised for immediate suspension of Thomas pending full investigation. It passed by a clear majority. Thomas gathered his papers with stiff movements. You're making a mistake, he said to the board. Daniel's voice was steady. The mistake was trusting you. As Thomas left the room, he paused near me. This isn't over, he murmured quietly enough that only I could hear. I held his gaze. It never is. When the door closed behind him, the tension in the room released in a collective exhale. Arthur lowered himself back into his chair, visibly exhausted but resolute. Thank you, he said to the board. Transparency is the only path forward. Karen nodded once. We will complete the full audit and provide recommendations. As the meeting adjourned, my phone vibrated again. I ignored it until I stepped into the hallway. 3 missed calls from my mother. 2 voicemails. I listened to the first one. How could you do this to your sister, she demanded. She says you're dragging our name into corporate scandal. I deleted it without finishing. The second was my father. His voice sounded tired. Dulce, I don't know what's happening, but your sister is furious. She says you're destroying another family. Destroying another family. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so familiar. When I returned to Arthur's office, he was sitting quietly while Margaret adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. Daniel stood by the window staring out at the river. It's done, Claire said softly when she saw me. For now. Arthur looked at me directly. You stood up in that room like you belonged there. I didn't feel like I belonged, I admitted. He smiled faintly. That's the difference between ego and integrity. Margaret approached and took my hands in hers. We would have lost everything if you hadn't insisted on questions. I shook my head. You would have found the truth eventually. Perhaps, she said, but not before damage was done. Her words carried weight, not just about business, about silence. Daniel stepped closer. We're pursuing legal action, full cooperation with authorities if necessary. You should, I said. He studied me for a moment. Why did you help us this much? The answer rose without hesitation. Because I know what it feels like when no one speaks up. The room grew quiet. Margaret squeezed my hand gently. You won't have to fight alone here. Later that evening, after the press had begun to circulate rumors of internal investigation, I sat alone in my apartment again. The same kitchen table, the same overhead light, but everything felt different. Vanessa had posted another message online. Some people think they're heroes, they just leave chaos behind. I closed the app. For most of my life, being called dramatic had made me shrink. Now I understood something. Conflict reveals fault lines that were already there. It doesn't create them. Arthur texted shortly after. Dinner Sunday still stands. I smiled despite the fatigue settling into my bones. In 1 week, I had gone from being told not to come home to standing in a boardroom defending a legacy that wasn't even mine. And for the first time, I wasn't asking for permission to be heard. The headlines started fading by Friday. Local business sections moved on to other scandals, other companies, other executives who had miscalculated how far they could stretch trust before it snapped. Callahan Construction remained under review, but the panic Thomas had engineered was gone. Contracts were being revalidated. Investors were quieter. Arthur's color had returned. He still tired easily, but there was a steadiness in him now that felt almost younger than before. Margaret called Saturday afternoon. We're having a small dinner tomorrow, she said. Just us. I would like you there. There was something in her tone that made it clear this wasn't about gratitude. It was about something else. When I arrived Sunday evening, the house felt different. Not tense, not celebratory, grounded. Arthur was already seated at the table when I walked in a glass of iced tea in front of him instead of wine. He looked up and smiled in that quiet way that didn't demand attention. You survived your first corporate war, he said. I laughed softly. I'm not sure that's over. It never is, he replied. But you stood firm. Margaret had set the table carefully. There were only 4 place settings tonight. Daniel, Claire, Arthur, and mine. She placed a folded card in front of my plate. My name was written in her neat handwriting again. I don't need that every time, I said. Yes, you do, she answered gently. Dinner moved easily. Daniel joked about how the board members suddenly discovered their moral compasses. Claire described calls from vendors expressing relief. Arthur listened more than he spoke. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat. I owe you something, he said, looking at me directly. You don't owe me anything. I owe you clarity. The room quieted. Thomas has been escorted out. Legal proceedings will follow. But that is not the only thing I need to say. Margaret reached across and touched his hand lightly. Arthur continued. I trusted the wrong man because he told me what I wanted to hear. I ignored small discomforts because confronting them felt exhausting. That mistake almost cost this family everything. He paused, studying me. You asked questions? You did not accept vague answers? I felt my shoulders tense slightly. Margaret's voice was soft but steady. Dulce, you did not overstep. You did not cause drama. You protected us. The words caught in my throat. I had spent my entire life being told the opposite. Claire leaned forward. We would not have uncovered this without you. Daniel nodded once. That's a fact. I looked down at my plate for a moment, overwhelmed in a way that had nothing to do with pressure. After dinner, Margaret and I stood side by side at the sink, washing dishes. The familiar domestic rhythm felt grounding. You looked frightened in the boardroom for a second, she said quietly. I admitted. Of him? Not exactly. I was afraid of being dismissed, of being told I didn't belong there. She dried her hands slowly. You belonged because you were truthful, not because of title or blood. Blood. The word echoed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. Margaret noticed. Is it your family? Yes. She did not ask for details. Instead, she said, you are allowed to build something healthier than what you were handed. Later that night when I returned home, I found a certified envelope slipped under my apartment door. My name typed neatly across the front. I stood in the hallway for a moment before picking it up. Inside was a letter from an attorney representing Vanessa. The language was formal and sharp. It alleged that I had made defamatory statements online about her and implied that my involvement with Callahan Construction was opportunistic and self-serving. I read it twice. Then I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Vanessa had not spoken to me directly about Thanksgiving in weeks. Instead, she had found a way to weaponize perception again. I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. Everything all right, I explained briefly. The letter, the accusation. There was no hesitation in her response. Bring it over tomorrow. We'll have our attorney review it. You don't need to get involved in this. We already are, she said. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. For years, I had internalized every accusation. Dramatic, sensitive, difficult. Now the accusations felt hollow. Monday morning, I drove back to Evanston with the letter in my bag. Daniel's attorney skimmed it and shook his head. There is no substance here, he said. It is intimidation. That word again? Arthur sat across from him, listening carefully. We can respond formally if necessary, the attorney continued, but my recommendation is to ignore it unless she escalates further. Ignore it. For most of my life, ignoring conflict had meant swallowing it. This felt different. It felt like declining to participate in manipulation. After the attorney left, Margaret poured tea and sat beside me. You don't have to carry this alone, she said. I swallowed hard. I'm tired of fighting. She looked at me for a long moment. You are not fighting for approval here. That's the difference. Arthur joined us, slowly lowering himself into the armchair opposite mine. I let silence harm people I loved once, he said. I won't do that again. I met his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, if your family continues this, we respond as a family. The word landed gently but firmly. Family. That evening, as I drove back toward Chicago, I realized something subtle had shifted inside me. I no longer felt like a guest at the Callahan table. I felt anchored. At home, my phone buzzed again. A text from Vanessa. You think they're your real family now? I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed a single reply. I think I deserve one that shows up. I set the phone down and turned off the light. For the first time since Thanksgiving, sleep came without replaying old arguments in my head. Somewhere between hospital corridors and boardrooms and dinner tables with my name written in ink, something steady had taken root. And I had the feeling that whatever Margaret wanted to discuss next was going to change more than just my legal standing. Margaret chose a small lakeside cafe in Evanston for the conversation she said could not wait. The windows faced the gray water of Lake Michigan, restless but steady, and for a few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. Arthur's new medication schedule, Daniel's plans for restructuring reporting lines, Claire's frustration with media calls that would not stop. Then Margaret set her cup down carefully and looked at me in a way that felt deliberate. What I'm about to say is not impulsive, she said. My stomach tightened slightly. Arthur and I have been talking, she continued, about legacy, about permanence, about what family means when it is tested. I listened without interrupting. There is a legal process in Illinois, she said, that allows an adult to be adopted by another family. It is not common, but it is real. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. She held my gaze steadily. We would like you to consider it. The air seemed to shift around me. Adopted. You don't have to answer right now, she added quickly. This is not about gratitude. It is not about business. It is about recognizing what already exists. I tried to steady my breathing. Margaret, I don't even know what to say. Say what you feel, she replied gently. I feel like this is too much. Like I would be betraying my parents? Margaret did not flinch at the word betraying. Your parents chose distance. You did not. That sentence landed deeper than I expected. Arthur walked into the cafe a few minutes later, slower than before, but with the same quiet resolve. He slid into the seat beside Margaret. We discussed it together, he said. This is not charity. You have stood beside us when you had no obligation to. That matters. My mind raced. Adoption meant legal ties. It meant my name on official documents. It meant inheritance rights equal to Daniel and Claire. You already have children, I said quietly. I don't want to complicate anything. Daniel and Claire were part of this discussion, Arthur replied. There is no complication, only clarity. I looked down at my hands. My entire life, I had been the expendable one, the acceptable sacrifice when comfort required someone to step aside. And now 2 people were asking to make me permanent. What if my parents find out I asked? Margaret's expression softened. They likely will. That is not your responsibility to manage. Arthur leaned forward slightly. You saved my life, yes. But more than that, you refused to be silent when deception threatened this family. That is the kind of daughter any father would be proud to claim. Daughter. The word pressed against my ribs in a way that made it difficult to speak. I need time, I said finally. Take it, Margaret answered immediately. We are not rushing you. But even as she said it, I knew something inside me had already shifted. That evening, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. It was my mother. We heard something absurd she said without greeting. That you're trying to have yourself adopted. The news traveled faster than I expected. Who told you that I asked? Vanessa has friends everywhere, she snapped. Is it true? I took a breath. We're considering it. You cannot replace us, she said sharply. I'm not replacing anyone, I replied calmly. My father's voice appeared faintly in the background, asking what was happening. You're humiliating us, my mother continued. People are talking. They think we drove you away. You told me not to come home, I said quietly. That was one holiday. It was never just one holiday. Silence followed. Vanessa believes you're doing this for money, my mother added, to get your hands on their inheritance. The accusation would have crushed me months earlier. Now it only confirmed the pattern. This isn't about money, I said. It's about belonging. My father finally came on the line. Dulce, he said softly, don't do something permanent out of anger. I closed my eyes. I'm not angry. Then why? Because I'm tired of waiting to be chosen. He had no response to that. 2 weeks later, I sat inside a quiet law office in Evanston reviewing adoption paperwork. The attorney explained the process clearly. Petition filed, background checks completed, court appearance scheduled, consent from all parties. I signed my name carefully on the preliminary documents. My hand trembled only slightly. Daniel and Claire were present when Arthur and Margaret signed theirs. There was no tension in the room, only calm certainty. We will stand with you in court, Daniel said simply. Claire squeezed my shoulder. You're already family. This just makes it official. The hearing was scheduled for early spring. In the meantime, Vanessa escalated. She posted publicly about children abandoning parents. She hinted that I was exploiting an elderly man for financial gain. An aunt from Columbus sent me a quiet message late one evening. I always knew you deserved better. I stared at that message longer than any of the angry ones. The day of the hearing arrived sooner than expected. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. A few wooden benches, a single judge reviewing routine petitions. When our case was called, I stood beside Arthur and Margaret. The judge looked at me directly. Are you entering this adoption voluntarily and without coercion? Yes, I answered. Are you aware that this will legally sever certain rights connected to your biological parents? I am. Arthur's hand rested lightly at my back, steady, but not controlling. Margaret's fingers intertwined with mine. The judge nodded once and signed the order. Just like that, ink on paper transformed something invisible into something recognized. A clerk handed me a certified copy of the decree. My last name would change. My legal parents would be listed as Arthur and Margaret Callahan. Outside the courthouse, Margaret hugged me tightly. My daughter, she whispered. Arthur's eyes shone in a way that surprised me. Welcome home. I felt lighter. Not because I had erased my past, but because I had stopped fighting for its approval. That evening, as I placed the certified document in a safe folder inside my apartment, my phone buzzed again. A text from Vanessa. You've made your choice. I looked at the message for a long time. Yes, I typed back finally. I have. And for the first time, I felt no need to explain it. The first time I signed my new name, my hand paused for a second before the last letter. Dulce Callahan. It looked unfamiliar and completely right at the same time. The paperwork took a few weeks to filter through banks, licenses, insurance forms, every place where identity lives quietly in file cabinets and databases. Each signature felt less like erasing something and more like stepping fully into something that had already been true. Arthur insisted on taking me to lunch the day my new driver's license arrived. Margaret came too. We sat at a small Italian place near the courthouse, sunlight pouring through the front windows. He held the plastic card between his fingers and studied it like it was a trophy. Looks official to me, he said. Margaret squeezed my hand. It has been official in our hearts for years. I laughed softly, but my throat felt tight. I had spent so much of my life being the afterthought. Now my name was listed in legal documents beside theirs, not as a guest, not as a rescuer, as daughter. The backlash began quietly and then gathered momentum. Vanessa posted a long message on social media about loyalty, about blood, about daughters who abandon parents for wealth. She never used my name, but everyone who knew us understood. My phone filled with messages from distant cousins and old church friends. Some were accusatory, some were confused. A few were supportive in whispers. One text from my mother stood out. I don't recognize you anymore. I stared at that sentence for a long time. I typed back slowly. I'm finally recognizing myself. There was no reply. James had been steady through all of it. He came into the picture quietly months after Arthur's heart attack, introduced through a community fundraiser Margaret dragged me to. He was patient observant, not the kind of man who needed to dominate a room. When I told him about the adoption, he listened without interrupting. How do you feel, he asked, relieved I admitted, and terrified that I'll regret it. He shook his head gently. Regret comes from betraying yourself. You didn't. The wedding planning began shortly after. We chose a small stone church near the lake, nothing extravagant but warm and timeless. The reception would be held in a restored barn, outside the city strings of soft lights overhead. The question of the program was unavoidable. Parents of the bride? I stared at the proof draft on my laptop for nearly an hour before typing the names. Arthur and Margaret Callahan. I did not hesitate. We mailed the invitations in early spring. I knew word would travel. It always did. 3 weeks later, my father called. Not my mother, not Vanessa. My father. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Dulcie, I received something in the mail. The invitation, I said calmly. There was a pause. It lists different parents. Yes. Another pause longer. Is that how you want it? It's already how it is, I replied. He exhaled slowly. Your mother is very upset. I'm sure she is. You didn't invite us? No, I didn't. Silence stretched between us. Are we not your family anymore? He asked finally. I swallowed carefully. You chose distance. I chose people who stayed. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. That hurt more than anger would have. I hope you're happy, he said before hanging up. I stood in my kitchen for several minutes afterward staring at the blank wall. I was not triumphant. I was steady. The week before the wedding, Margaret and I met with the florist. White roses, soft greenery, simple elegance. Are you nervous? She asked as we walked back to the car. Not about marrying James. About them, she clarified. I had hired discreet security for the reception. Not because I wanted confrontation, but because I knew Vanessa. She had never accepted being excluded from control. If they come, I said quietly, I won't run. Margaret nodded. Whatever happens, you are not alone. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. The lake shimmered beyond the church windows. In the bridal suite, Margaret adjusted my veil with careful hands. You look exactly like yourself, she said softly. That was the best compliment she could have given me. Arthur knocked before entering. His suit fit him neatly, posture straighter than I had seen in months. He looked proud. Ready, kiddo, he asked. I smiled. Ready. The ceremony moved in a blur of vows and music and the warmth of familiar faces. James's hands were steady when he placed the ring on my finger. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause felt like a wave lifting us forward. The reception unfolded in laughter and dancing. Daniel gave a heartfelt toast. Claire teased Arthur gently about crying too early. Then the security coordinator approached quietly. There are 3 individuals at the entrance claiming to be family. My heart slowed instead of racing. Are they causing trouble? I asked. Not yet. James squeezed my hand. What do you want to do? I considered it carefully. I could have had them turned away. I could have shielded myself entirely. Let them in, I said. Seat them in the back. When they entered the barn, I saw them immediately. Vanessa in a sharp blue dress, chin lifted. My mother stiff beside her. My father looking smaller than I remembered. The program lay folded in Vanessa's hand. She must have seen the printed names by then. The MC stepped to the microphone for a formal introduction of the parents. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride, Arthur and Margaret Callahan. The room rose in applause. Arthur stood tall beside Margaret, smiling, accepting the gratitude without theatrics. Across the room, my mother's face drained of color. Vanessa's jaw tightened. They had not expected the finality of ink on paper. Vanessa pushed forward through the crowd before I could reach her. You think this makes it real? She whispered sharply. It is real, I replied calmly. You replaced us. No, I said. You stepped back. My father's eyes were wet. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Arthur appeared at my side without raising his voice. This is her day, he said evenly. Please respect it. Vanessa laughed once, bitter and short. This is humiliating. Only if you came to claim something that isn't yours, I answered. The music resumed softly around us. Conversations began again, though quieter than before. I looked at my parents, the ones who had raised me, and felt something I did not expect. Not anger, not victory, a kind of distant compassion. I don't hate you, I said quietly, but I won't shrink myself to fit your version of me anymore. My father nodded slowly. I should have done better, he murmured. Yes, I said gently. You should have. Security approached discreetly. Vanessa protested under her breath, but she did not fight when escorted out. My mother followed rigid and silent. My father glanced back once before disappearing through the barn doors. When the doors closed, the air felt lighter. James pulled me into his arms. You okay? I am, I said truthfully. And as the music swelled again, and the guests returned to dancing, I realized something profound. I had not invited them to prove a point. I had allowed them to witness a boundary. For years, I had been told that setting boundaries was revenge, that protecting myself was selfish. Standing there in the glow of string lights with Arthur laughing near the bar and Margaret hugging guests like a proud mother, I understood the difference. Revenge seeks to wound. Boundaries simply close a door. The night ended with quiet embraces and tired smiles. When the last guests left and the barn grew still, Arthur placed his hand on my shoulder. You handled that with grace, he said. I handled it with clarity, I replied. And for the first time in my life, clarity did not feel lonely. The first time I signed my new name, my hand paused for a second before the last letter. Dulce Callahan. It looked unfamiliar and completely right at the same time. The paperwork took a few weeks to filter through banks' licenses, insurance forms, every place where identity lives quietly in file cabinets and databases. Each signature felt less like erasing something and more like stepping fully into something that had already been true. Arthur insisted on taking me to lunch the day my new driver's license arrived. Margaret came too. We sat at a small Italian place near the courthouse, sunlight pouring through the front windows. He held the plastic card between his fingers and studied it like it was a trophy. Looks official to me, he said. Margaret squeezed my hand. It has been official in our hearts for years. I laughed softly, but my throat felt tight. I had spent so much of my life being the afterthought. Now my name was listed in legal documents beside theirs, not as a guest, not as a rescuer, as daughter. The backlash began quietly and then gathered momentum. Vanessa posted a long message on social media about loyalty, about blood, about daughters who abandoned parents for wealth. She never used my name, but everyone who knew us understood. My phone filled with messages from distant cousins and old church friends. Some were accusatory, some were confused. A few were supportive in whispers. One text from my mother stood out. I don't recognize you anymore. I stared at that sentence for a long time. I typed back slowly. I'm finally recognizing myself. There was no reply. James had been steady through all of it. He came into the picture quietly months after Arthur's heart attack, introduced through a community fundraiser Margaret dragged me to. He was patient, observant, not the kind of man who needed to dominate a room. When I told him about the adoption, he listened without interrupting. How do you feel, he asked. Relieved, I admitted, and terrified that I'll regret it. He shook his head gently. Regret comes from betraying yourself. You didn't. The wedding planning began shortly after. We chose a small stone church near the lake, nothing extravagant but warm and timeless. The reception would be held in a restored barn, outside the city strings of soft lights overhead. The question of the program was unavoidable. Parents of the bride. I stared at the proof draft on my laptop for nearly an hour before typing the names. Arthur and Margaret Callahan. I did not hesitate. We mailed the invitations in early spring. I knew word would travel. It always did. 3 weeks later, my father called. Not my mother. Not Vanessa. My father. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Dulcie, I received something in the mail. The invitation, I said calmly. There was a pause. It lists different parents. Yes. Another pause longer. Is that how you want it? It's already how it is, I replied. He exhaled slowly. Your mother is very upset. I'm sure she is. You didn't invite us. No, I didn't. Silence stretched between us. Are we not your family anymore? He asked finally. I swallowed carefully. You chose distance. I chose people who stayed. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. That hurt more than anger would have. I hope you're happy, he said before hanging up. I stood in my kitchen for several minutes afterward, staring at the blank wall. I was not triumphant. I was steady. The week before the wedding, Margaret and I met with the florist. White roses, soft greenery, simple elegance. Are you nervous? She asked as we walked back to the car. Not about marrying James. About them, she clarified. I had hired discreet security for the reception, not because I wanted confrontation, but because I knew Vanessa. She had never accepted being excluded from control. If they come, I said quietly, I won't run. Margaret nodded. Whatever happens, you are not alone. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. The lake shimmered beyond the church windows. In the bridal suite, Margaret adjusted my veil with careful hands. You look exactly like yourself, she said softly. That was the best compliment she could have given me. Arthur knocked before entering. His suit fit him neatly postured straighter than I had seen in months. He looked proud. Ready, kiddo? He asked. I smiled. Ready. The ceremony moved in a blur of vows and music, and the warmth of familiar faces. James's hands were steady when he placed the ring on my finger. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause felt like a wave lifting us forward. The reception unfolded in laughter and dancing. Daniel gave a heartfelt toast. Claire teased Arthur gently about crying too early. Then the security coordinator approached quietly. There are 3 individuals at the entrance claiming to be family. My heart slowed instead of racing. Are they causing trouble? I asked. Not yet. James squeezed my hand. What do you want to do? I considered it carefully. I could have had them turned away. I could have shielded myself entirely. Let them in, I said. Seat them in the back. When they entered the barn, I saw them immediately. Vanessa in a sharp blue dress, chin lifted. My mother stiff beside her. My father looking smaller than I remembered. The program lay folded in Vanessa's hand. She must have seen the printed names by then. The MC stepped to the microphone for a formal introduction of the parents. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the parents of the bride. Arthur and Margaret Callahan. The room rose in applause. Arthur stood tall beside Margaret, smiling, accepting the gratitude without theatrics. Across the room, my mother's face drained of color. Vanessa's jaw tightened. They had not expected the finality of ink on paper. Vanessa pushed forward through the crowd before I could reach her. You think this makes it real? She whispered sharply. It is real, I replied calmly. You replaced us? No, I said. You stepped back. My father's eyes were wet. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Arthur appeared at my side without raising his voice. This is her day, he said evenly. Please respect it. Vanessa laughed once, bitter and short. This is humiliating. Only if you came to claim something that isn't yours? I answered. The music resumed softly around us. Conversations began again, though quieter than before. I looked at my parents, the ones who had raised me, and felt something I did not expect. Not anger, not victory. A kind of distant compassion. I don't hate you, I said quietly, but I won't shrink myself to fit your version of me anymore. My father nodded slowly. I should have done better, he murmured. Yes, I said gently. You should have? Security approached discreetly. Vanessa protested under her breath, but she did not fight when escorted out. My mother followed rigid and silent. My father glanced back once before disappearing through the barn doors. When the doors closed, the air felt lighter. James pulled me into his arms. You okay? I am, I said truthfully. And as the music swelled again and the guests returned to dancing, I realized something profound. I had not invited them to prove a point. I had allowed them to witness a boundary. For years, I had been told that setting boundaries was revenge, that protecting myself was selfish. Standing there in the glow of string lights with Arthur laughing near the bar and Margaret hugging guests like a proud mother, I understood the difference. Revenge seeks to wound. Boundaries simply close a door. The night ended with quiet embraces and tired smiles. When the last guests left and the barn grew still, Arthur placed his hand on my shoulder. You handled that with grace, he said. I handled it with clarity, I replied. And for the first time in my life, clarity did not feel lonely. The house felt different when we returned from our honeymoon. Not quieter, not emptier, just settled. Like something long unsettled had finally been placed where it belonged. James carried our suitcases inside while I stood for a moment in the driveway, looking at the modest brick house we had bought just a few miles from Arthur and Margaret. Close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough to build our own rhythm. You coming in? He called gently. In a minute, I said. The air was crisp late summer sliding into early fall. I breathed in deeply and realized I was no longer bracing for anything. The morning after the wedding, my phone had exploded with opinions. Distant relatives lecturing about loyalty, church acquaintances questioning my decisions. Vanessa's post had gone further than before, accusing me of orchestrating public humiliation. I had read them all. Then I had done something I never used to do. I deleted them without responding. Aunt Carol sent a separate message later that evening. I'm proud of you for choosing peace. I should have said something years ago. I read that one twice. It was the only apology I needed from that side of the family. Arthur invited us over the following Sunday. He had insisted on grilling himself, though Margaret hovered nearby, pretending she was not supervising. When we arrived, Daniel and Claire were already there. The atmosphere was easy normal. No one tiptoed around what had happened. Arthur handed James a pair of tongs. Think you can handle burgers without starting a fire? James grinned. I make no promises. Margaret pulled me aside in the kitchen. How are you really? I considered the question carefully. Lighter. That's good, she said, squeezing my hand. Later that evening, Arthur stepped into his study and returned with a thick folder. He set it on the dining table. I want everyone here for this, he said. Daniel and Claire exchanged curious glances. I have updated my will, Arthur continued. And the company trust. Transparency prevents resentment. My chest tightened slightly. He opened the folder and laid out the documents. My name appeared alongside Daniel and Claire's. Equal shares, equal standing. I didn't expect this, I said quietly. Margaret looked at me with that steady gaze again. You are our daughter, not a guest. Not a footnote. Daniel nodded. We're good with this. You earned your place long before the paperwork. Claire smiled warmly. Family isn't arithmetic. For years, I had been accused of chasing inheritance. Now I saw the irony clearly. I had not pursued wealth. I had pursued belonging. My phone buzzed against the table. Vanessa again. You've turned them against us, her message read. I did not respond. Arthur noticed my expression. Everything all right? Yes, I said calmly. Just noise. That night, James and I sat on our back porch, the faint sound of cicadas in the trees. Do you ever worry they'll try something legal? He asked. Vanessa had hinted at contesting the adoption, at challenging the will, at stirring up trouble. The attorney had already confirmed there was no legal ground. But legal threats are often about intimidation, not outcome. If they do, I said we'll handle it. You don't sound afraid. I'm not, I realized. For the first time, my stability did not depend on their approval. Weeks passed. Vanessa's attempts grew sporadic, then dramatic again. A certified letter arrived suggesting civil action over emotional distress. Our attorney replied firmly, no basis, no case. After that silence. Then one afternoon, my father appeared at our front door, alone. James opened it and called for me. I stepped into the hallway slowly. My father looked smaller than he had at the wedding. His shoulders slumped, his eyes tired. Can I come in? He asked quietly. I hesitated only a second before nodding. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where James and I had eaten takeout our first week in the house. Your mother won't come, he said. Vanessa is furious. She thinks you betrayed us publicly. I folded my hands together. I did not betray anyone. He nodded faintly. I know. The admission surprised me. I should have defended you years ago, he continued. When Vanessa blamed you for everything, when your mother told you to stay home. I told myself I was keeping the peace. Keeping the peace often means sacrificing someone quieter, I said gently. He looked at me, then really looked. I didn't realize how often that someone was you. Silence settled between us. I don't expect you to undo anything I added. I can't, he admitted. We sat there for a long moment, two adults acknowledging what had always been present but never spoken. I'm not asking to be restored, he said finally. I just wanted you to know I see it now. That was more than I had received in 30 years. When he left, I did not feel triumphant. I felt complete. Margaret called that evening. How did it go? He apologized, I said. And I believed him. She paused. Forgiveness does not require access, she said softly. I understood what she meant. Thanksgiving approached again. The first since the wedding. Arthur insisted on hosting the entire extended Callahan family. The table stretched nearly from one end of the dining room to the other. Daniel's children ran in circles. Claire arranged centerpieces with careful precision. Margaret handed me a stack of folded place cards. Would you help set the table? I began placing names carefully in front of each chair. When I reached the head of the table, she handed me one final card. Dulcie Callahan. I smiled at her. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do, she said. That evening, as the turkey rested and the house filled with warmth, Arthur raised his glass. 5 years ago, he began. I collapsed on a sidewalk because I ignored warning signs. A young woman refused to ignore me. Laughter rippled through the room. She saved my life, he continued, but more importantly, she joined it. I felt James squeeze my hand under the table. Margaret dabbed at her eyes discreetly. And now Arthur finished She is our daughter in every way that matters. Glasses clinked. I looked around that long table at faces turned toward me, not with obligation, but with affection. No empty chair, no erased presents. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the children had fallen asleep on couches, James and I stepped onto the back porch. Do you ever think about them? He asked softly. Sometimes, I admitted. Do you miss them? I considered the question carefully. I miss what I wish they had been, not what they were. He nodded slowly. Through the window, I could see Arthur leaning back in his chair, Margaret laughing beside him, Daniel stacking plates, Claire wrapping leftovers. For most of my life, I thought being chosen meant competing, proving, shrinking. Now I understood something different. Being chosen means being kept. And as the night air cooled and the house behind us hummed with easy conversation, I realized the next chapter of my life would not be about defending my place. It would be about building something even stronger. A year later, I was standing in the nursery holding a paintbrush, staring at a wall that had just turned the softest shade of sage green. James was on the floor assembling a crib with far more confidence than the instruction manual deserved. Arthur had insisted on building the rocking chair himself, sanding every edge smooth with the patience of a man who understood how fragile beginnings could be. Margaret sat on the window seat folding tiny onesies, her expression calm and luminous. You're nesting early, she teased gently. I smiled. I think I've been nesting my whole life. Pregnancy shifted something inside me that went beyond hormones and exhaustion. I found myself thinking about the girl I had been at 18, at 25, at 30, waiting for permission to take up space. Now I was preparing a room for someone who would never have to earn her place. The day our daughter was born, Margaret stood beside my hospital bed while James held my hand. Arthur paced the hallway until a nurse finally convinced him to sit. When they placed that tiny warm weight against my chest, something inside me unlocked completely. Welcome home, I whispered to her. Margaret cried openly. Arthur tried not to, and failed. We named her Lily Grace Callahan. The Callahan part felt deliberate, not as a rejection of where I came from, but as a declaration of where I stood. The months that followed were chaotic in the way new life always is. Sleepless nights, bottles warming at 3 a.m, Margaret arriving unannounced with casseroles and steady hands. Arthur rocking Lily with a quiet patience that made me ache in the best way. One evening, as James and I sat on the back porch with Lily sleeping in a carrier between us, he asked the question gently. Do you ever wonder if things could have turned out differently with them? I looked out at the darkening sky. I used to imagine that all the time. That one conversation might have fixed everything. That one holiday might have healed 30 years. And now I don't replay it. There was no bitterness in my voice, only truth. 5 years after that Thanksgiving night, Arthur insisted on telling the story again at dinner. He described the cold air, the sidewalk, the way he thought he would not see Margaret again. Then he described the moment I appeared. She didn't hesitate, he said, looking at Lily on my lap. Your mother has always been that way. The table erupted in warm laughter. Daniel teased Arthur about embellishing. Claire passed the mashed potatoes. Margaret squeezed my shoulder from behind. I looked down the length of that long wooden table. Every seat filled, every voice layered over the next without competition. There was no empty chair. Later that night, after the dishes were stacked and the leftovers wrapped, I stepped outside alone for a moment. The air was crisp again, just like it had been that first Thanksgiving. But I was not wandering anymore. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. A message from my father. Happy Thanksgiving. I hope you're well. I stared at it for a moment, feeling the old reflex to decode, to overthink. Instead, I typed back, we are. I hope you are too. It was enough. I did not invite them to next year's dinner. I did not block them either. I simply held my boundary like a closed gate that no longer needed to be guarded every hour. Margaret stepped outside and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. You're quiet, she said. I'm grateful, I answered honestly. She nodded. Gratitude is lighter than anger. I leaned into her slightly. For a long time, I thought setting boundaries was revenge. It isn't, she said gently. It's survival, I finished. Inside the house, Lily began to fuss softly. Arthur's voice followed, low and comforting. I went back inside and took my daughter into my arms. She blinked up at me, unaware of generational patterns, unaware of the years I had spent shrinking to make others comfortable. "You will never have to fight for a seat at my table," I whispered to her. James caught my eye across the room and smiled. That night, when the house finally quieted and the lights dimmed, I stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table one more time. 5 years earlier, I had been told not to come home. Now I was standing in the home I had built, surrounded by people who chose me without hesitation. If you have ever been told you are too much, too sensitive, too dramatic for asking to be treated fairly, I want you to hear something clearly. You are not the problem. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop waiting to be invited and start building her own table. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by who shows up when your life is on the line, by who stands beside you when accusations fly, by who writes your name down and refuses to erase it. Walking away is not cruelty. Protecting your peace is not betrayal. It is choosing yourself when no one else will. And when you do, you may find something unexpected waiting on the other side. Not revenge, not vindication, home. If this story has felt familiar in any way, if you have ever had to draw a line to protect your own heart, share your experience. You are not alone in it. And if you believe more women deserve to hear that being chosen is their right, stay connected. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well surrounded by the family who keeps your seat warm. Disclaimer: this video is created solely for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. While we strive to ensure our content is thoughtful and well-researched, it is based on publicly available sources, including news articles, social media discussions, public forums, editorial analyses, and user-generated content. Please note that we do not guarantee absolute accuracy, nor do we claim to provide official, definitive, or exhaustive information. This content does not constitute professional advice of any kind. We strongly encourage viewers to perform their own fact-checking and consult reliable sources before forming opinions or making decisions. Our intent: this content is not intended to discredit, defame, or harm any individual, group, entity, or nation. Instead, our goal is to present diverse perspectives, raise awareness, and foster respectful dialogue and deeper reflection on the world around us. We invite you to approach all content with a critical mind and an open heart. Thank you for watching and for being a valued member of our community.